Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. Our guest today is Scott Klusendorf. Scott, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Good to be with you, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Let me tell you all about Scott. Scott is president of Life Training Institute and the author of The Case for Life, Equipping Christians to Engage the Culture. Scott has taught pro-life apologetics at the graduate level at Biola University and Trinity Law School, and has lectured at over 80 colleges and universities, including Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, USC, Johns Hopkins, MIT, and the U.S. Air Force Academy. It's pretty impressive, Scott, to name a few. Scott also helps pregnancy resource centers raise money to assist women facing unplanned pregnancies. The dollars raised help women with shelter, baby clothes, parenting classes, and medical care. Scott himself is a graduate of UCLA and holds a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola University. He and his wife Stephanie have been married since 1985, and they have 4 children. Is that about right?
That's right on.
Scott, we appreciate your ministry, and I have a few questions for you, and thank you for taking the time today. So what was it that first sparked your interest in pro-life issues?
Well, there were 2 key events. The first was a concert in 1980 with an original Christian contemporary music band called the Second Chapter of Acts.
Yep.
And they are responsible for hymns like Easter Song and other songs we sometimes sing in church. But they did a concert at the Long Beach Arena in Southern California with about 18,000 people present. And the lead singer from that group, Annie Herring, did a song that night I don't think she had ever done before. It was called They're Killing Thousands, and it was about abortion. And it was a haunting lyric. And boy, that struck me. And that was really the first time at age 20 I had ever really thought much about abortion. And then fast forward 10 years. I'm a youth pastor at a church in Southern California, and I'm invited by the local pregnancy center director to hear a lecture for pastors on abortion. And I'm thinking, okay, this will be great. 100 of my buddies in the area will show up and I'll get a free breakfast. Sure, I'll go to that. Well, it was me, 4 other guys, and their wives. That was it who showed up. But thankfully, the speaker, Greg Cunningham, a former member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and former Reagan administration Justice Department official, spoke that day, and he laid out a case, Todd, for the pro-life view that I thought was articulate, well-reasoned, and I thought, I like this guy. He doesn't hurt the brain to listen to. But then he did something that changed forever the trajectory of my life. He showed an 8-minute video depicting abortion. Todd, I had never seen abortion, and I sat there and wept, and I thought to myself, I am no different than the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side of the road. I say I care about this, but I don't act like I care about it. So I went home that day and I took that VHS tape he showed in November of 1990. By the way, for any of your listeners, VHS tapes were these rectangular things we used to watch movies on. And I showed that video to my wife and said, I feel like my whole life has just been interrupted. And sure enough, it was. 6 months later, with the blessing of my church, I resigned my associate pastor's role to pursue training pro-life Christians how to make a case for the pro-life view. So that's what I've been doing since that time.
So Scott, you mentioned going to this gathering and you expected a large crowd. There weren't many people there who, at the time, I think you said 4 youth ministers and maybe their wife. So what impacted you to see that the church or church involvement is crucial to the pro-life movement? What helped you understand the importance of the church being involved in this issue?
Honestly, the thing that did the most help for me was seeing the images. And here's why. If a pastor is not more horrified of abortion than he is terrified of what will happen to him if he preaches on it, he's going to remain silent in the pulpit. And until we're heartbroken over this issue, we're often not courageous enough to make the changes we need to make a difference in the culture. So that day set me on a course to figure out, what does a pro-life church look like? What does a pro-life Christian look like? And I think pro-life churches, just to lay out a very quick summary here, need to be committed to 3 essential tasks. Number 1, they need to preach, teach a biblical view of human value, that humans are made in the image of God, and thus they have intrinsic value, not instrumental value. Secondly, they need to preach, teach, and counsel that abortion is a sin, and need to equip their members to communicate a pro-life view. And then thirdly, they need to minister to the thousands of people in our churches who've been wounded by abortion, who can only be healed not by covering up the truth, but by pointing them to the only one who can heal them. That is Jesus and his gospel.
So, what are some practical things that each church can do to make a difference on the issue of life? So, you mentioned those three, that there's going to be a preaching a biblical understanding
Right.
of made in the image of God, giver of life, abortion is a sin, and then helping folks that are dealing with unplanned pregnancies. Help us further on practical things a church can do, maybe what your church does or what you've seen other churches do.
Yeah, here's what I think needs to be done, and to some extent, we've done this at my church, at my local church here in Noonan, Georgia. Number one, from the pulpit, in preaching a biblical view of human value, here's the pro-life case we need to make. Too often, what we do is we just open Psalm 139 and think, okay, we've read that, we're done. That really isn't what we need to do in making our biblical case. Not that that's wrong, but here's, I think, what we need to teach. Premise one. Scripture teaches that all humans have value because they bear the image of God. Genesis 1 teaches that in the Old Covenant. James 3 teaches it in the New. Premise 2, because humans bear the image of God and thus have intrinsic value, the shedding of innocent blood, meaning the intentional killing of innocent human beings, is strictly forbidden. Exodus 23 teaches this, Proverbs 6 teaches this, Matthew 5 teaches this. So if you take those first two premises, Todd, it's real easy what the next question is. Are the unborn human beings? Because if they are, the same commands against the shedding of innocent blood apply to the unborn as they do everybody else. And the reason why we need to make our case this way in the local church, critics now, ever since Dobbs, really they've been doing it before Dobbs, but especially since the Dobbs decision, they're saying, well, what are you all worked about? The Bible doesn't even mention the word abortion. It doesn't even teach expressly that the unborn are human. Okay, I don't think that's true, but let's grant both premises. I can still show the Bible is pro-life by simply using that argument, that syllogism I just gave you, that throughout Scripture, humans have value because they bear the image of God. Because they bear the image of God, shedding of innocent blood is strictly forbidden. Given the unborn are human, the same commands against the shedding of innocent blood apply to them as they do everybody else. That's the clear case we need to be making biblically. But we also have to equip our people apologetically. And this is where we're really dropping the ball, Todd. I teach at Summit Ministries, which is a Christian worldview conference for students. Every 2 weeks throughout the summer, we get another group of 200 students that come out to Manitou Springs, Colorado, and they are coming from the finest churches in America. We're talking churches that are thriving, growing, and they send their kids to Summit to prepare them for the intellectual challenges they'll face at college. We've been running an informal poll for 6 years at Summit. And here's the question we put to the students. How many of you, before coming to Summit, have ever heard in your church a pro-life apologetics presentation aimed at equipping you to defend the pro-life view with unbelievers? Out of 200 students present at every session, we're lucky to get 11 hands that go up. Now, that says to me that even in the best of churches, we're falling down on the job equipping people. And then finally, of course, you and I have both met people wounded by abortion, right, shattered by it. And I think the temptation of clergy is to say, well, we don't want to lay a guilt trip on these people, so we won't talk about abortion. The problem is when we fail to talk about abortion, we don't spare wounded people healing. I should say we don't spare them guilt. We spare them healing because unconfessed sin has them out of full fellowship with Christ. So I think these are things that local churches can focus in on, and especially in a post-Dobbs era where the misinformation is running rampant and where believers themselves are becoming confused on what the real issues are.
So Scott, let's go back to your 3 points on the life case. Can you add a little scripture to each of those? I mean, I feel certain you can do that. You probably preach this sermon a lot, but flesh that out a little bit with a couple of Bible verses to help us even a little further on defending life.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me give you, first of all, a general one. And
Okay.
that is, we're told in Ephesians 5 that we are to expose evil deeds, not cover them up. And so, as a church proposes a strategy, I should say, for dealing with abortion, it ought to be guided by we ought to be light bearers. But beyond that, if we look at the Great Commission itself, what does Jesus give the church to do? Well, we're to go make disciples. What does it mean to go make disciples according to Matthew 28? Well, it means to teach people all that Christ has commanded us. What is one of those commands? We're not to shed innocent blood. What is abortion? The shedding of innocent blood. Therefore, abortion relates to the Great Commission mandate of the local church. It's not a distraction from it. And then also, if we look at Genesis 1:18 through 22, we get the biblical foundation for human value, that humans are made in the image of their creator. And from that, it follows their value is intrinsic, not something they earn through performance or function. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, Exodus 23:7 and Proverbs 6:16 to 19 talk about the shedding of innocent blood. And these are clear biblical mandates that apply to the issue of abortion. So abortion does relate to biblical teaching.
Scott, when you talk to pastors about addressing abortion in more than just a reading of Psalm 139, what kind of, if you get any pushback at all or objections, what kind of objections do you receive back from pastors?
The first is that they're afraid that they will end up chasing a distraction from their responsibilities, that their job is to preach the gospel. Look, we agree. We're not trying to turn churches into pro-life groups, but we do want churches to preach and teach biblical truth and biblical worldview. And as I just cited from the Great Commission, the pro-life issue fits within the disciple-making responsibilities of the local church. But the other thing that pastors fear, and listen, I was a pastor, I get this. They fear that somehow they're going to turn people off if they talk about abortion. I mean, this is guys like Tim Keller who fear this, that people who would be receptive to the gospel will somehow be turned off if we were to go and talk about an issue that they think differently on. I have found just the opposite is true. When non-believers hear a Christian lay out an articulate, thoughtful defense of a biblical issue like the pro-life issue, and they hear that person do it in an engaging way, it doesn't repel them. It actually is attractive because it says to the unbeliever, maybe, just maybe, these Christians are onto something. And if this Christian can make a solid case on the pro-life issue, is there anything else associated with that Christian worldview that maybe I ought to take a second look at? And I've had more than once when I've lectured in secular places, non-Christians come up to me and say, that's the first time I've ever heard a logical defense of the pro-life view. And I can't believe you're a Christian telling me this. I've had pastors give me testimonies who preached on abortion and afterward unbelievers telling them the exact same thing. Locally here, just a couple miles from my church, a pastor by the name of Michael Sherrard preached a pro-life sermon. There was an atheist present that day from Spain, and he had come to visit a friend, and the friend said, I want you to come to church. And he happens to show up on a day when Mike's preaching on abortion. And Mike's thinking, oh, great. Should I call an audible here and reschedule this pro-life talk? He thought, no, I'm going to go for it. And afterward, that Spanish atheist made a beeline for Mike and said, you have no idea what you just did to my worldview. And you did something that has just left me almost in total amazement. You stood up there for 55 minutes and laid out a case for your view on abortion that was thoughtful, reasonable, and I don't know what to do with that. Well, the friends took him to lunch that day and spent 2 hours talking about the gospel. What happened is the abortion issue opened the door to further gospel presentations. So I think pastors are missing an opportunity to further gospel presentations when they ignore the issue of abortion.
And we'll talk about resources in a minute that could be helpful for pastors. But let me just get one more question on feedback. So when you preach a pro-life sermon somewhere in your own church or in another church, what's the general feedback that you receive from the congregation? And then what's the extreme, the worst feedback that you may receive from others when preaching a pro-life?
Yeah, great question. The number one response I get, whether it's a church service, Summit Ministries, a Christian worldview forum, a Christian high school, a Catholic high school where we do a lot of speaking, the number one thing we hear, why have we never heard this before? I mean, it runs away. It's not even close. That's number one. Uh, and what these students and what a lot of young adults and mid-career people say is, we've been around church all our lives, but we've never heard the rationale for the pro-life view. We've never heard why we ought to be pro-life. We've heard that we should be, but not the reasoning behind it. And certainly nothing we could use with friends who don't come to church. Well, I got to tell you, Todd, that's heartbreaking to me.
Yeah.
That we are not equipped to convey a key biblical truth to a lost culture. That needs to change in our churches. As far as the pushback that's been negative, you're always going to get people who say, well, I feel you haven't been sensitive enough. No matter how sensitive you are, right. You could be the most loving person in the world and you'll still get accused of that. Or you'll hear that, well, I don't think you're really pro-life, because if you were really pro-life, what are you doing about immigrants? What are you doing about foreigners who want to reside here? What are you doing about poverty? And what are you doing about equitable pay for people? If you're not dealing with all those issues, you're not pro-life. As if somehow, because I oppose the intentional killing of an innocent human being, I have to take responsibility for fixing everything wrong with society. But that aside, pro-lifers do care for people after they're born. That's what pregnancy centers do all over this country. And by the way, they outnumber abortion clinics 3-1. So yeah, it's Kentucky, a factual misnomer.
In Kentucky, it's 25-1, Scott. We have 50 pregnancy resource centers and 2 abortion clinics, which right now are shut down at least
right.
in the middle of November.
There you go. Yeah. So if anything, I've understated the truth of my position here, and you guys are doing just a great job in that state. But these are pushbacks you'll get. And a lot of Christians, because they haven't been taught to think biblically on abortion, will parrot the objections they're hearing in the secular culture.
Well, and Scott, I've heard you on another podcast where, especially on the issue of if you're going to be pro-life, you need to be whole life, from the grave to the tomb, or from the cradle to the grave, and or from the womb to the tomb. And you're pretty careful to say certainly those things are important, but you really try to stay laser focused on the pro-life side of the matter, fighting against abortion.
Yeah, you're right, Todd. Listen, as Christians individually, we will care about a lot of issues. We're going to care about the poor. We're going to care about sex trafficking. We're going to care about immigrants. But it doesn't follow that the operational objectives of the pro-life movement have to be broad and inclusive as well. I mean, after all, was Winston Churchill too narrow because he focused on defeating the Nazis and not other issues going on in the world at that time? No, he focused on the most pressing need of the moment. And that's what pro-lifers are doing here. As individual Christians, our ethic is going to be broad and inclusive, but the operational goals of the pro-life movement are necessarily narrow. We are out to get legal protection for unborn humans. And we're not wrong to have a narrow focus. Nobody goes to groups that oppose sex trafficking and say, well, what are you doing about the environment? What are you doing about equal pay for poor people? I mean, it's only pro-lifers who get this.
That's very fair. You've been engaged in the battle to protect unborn life for a long time. How have you seen conversations change over the years, and then especially since the Dobbs case and the overturning of Roe?
There's been a definite shift since Dobbs. And what I'm hearing is mass hysteria from our opponents. And they never really felt threatened as long as Roe was there, as long as Planned Parenthood versus Casey was there. But with those 2 cases being overturned, now they've gone into full hysteria. And it's outright lying. I mean, for example, saying that pro-life laws are going to kill women because they can't get surgeries for ectopic pregnancies or for miscarriages. This is complete fabrication. It's not even misinformation. It's outright lying. And this is why we need our pulpits engaged. Christians need to know these are lies. They need to know that the other side is not being truthful. And we need to be prepared to say to our friends and neighbors, that's simply not true. And when you strip away the fear, you find that people are more willing to listen to the actual arguments that we're making. But we've got to correct this misinformation. And especially post Dobbs, the shift that we've seen is a leaving of any attempt to justify abortion on rational grounds, which was always shaky, but now they've just left it. And now it's just flat out lies. Let's just throw all kinds of lies on the board and hope a few of them stick, and that's enough to get us our victory.
So, Scott, you've addressed the dealing with the folks who are on the disinformation side, and that's definitely happening in every state where this issue's on the ballot. It is in Kentucky. We have a constitutional amendment coming up in November. But what about someone who just they're not where you are on abortion? They're kind of squishy on total ban of abortion, but for whichever one they pick. How do you interact with someone who's just a little squishy on certain issues of abortion?
I like to ask a good question and then state a syllogism. So let's take part one of that. Okay. My question is simply this: what's wrong with a law that says you can't intentionally kill innocent human beings? What's wrong with a law that says that? And of course, they've never thought about this. They're just parroting what they've heard in the media. And when you put it to people that way, it causes at least a few of them to go, you know what, maybe I do need to rethink that. What is wrong with a law that says you can't intentionally kill innocent human beings? Then I love to say, let me state for you the case I'm making. Premise one, it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Premise two, abortion is the intentional killing of an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion is wrong. And then I'll say to the person, can you tell me where that syllogism goes wrong? In other words, where is my argument off the tracks? I'm open-minded. I want to be right. I want to believe true things. Can you show me where my argument goes off the rails? And of course, they never do. At best, they come up with ad hominem attacks like, well, do you care about the women? What are you doing about the poor? And all the things we've already talked about. Or they may say something like, well, you're a man, you have no right to talk about this issue, as if arguments depend on the gender of the people making them. No, they stand or fall on their merits. And often we have to do a little pre-schooling here and remind people about the nature of arguments, that arguments are either sound or unsound, valid or invalid. You can't dismiss them by simply calling them religious. Also, you can't dismiss them based on the gender, race, appearance, nationality of the person making the argument. The argument stands on its own merits. These are basic things you and I knew since 7th grade, but this culture today has forgotten them, or worse yet, never been exposed to them. And so we may have to do a little bit of tutoring that way to help bring them into what is the main thing.
Scott, you've written a book called The Case for Life. I want to hear why you wrote that book, but you also co-authored Stand for Life, which is a student's guide for making the case and saving lives. I read this one and just love it in its simplicity, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, you make the case early on that your pro-life apologetic was pretty much the question of what is it? And can you speak to that just a little bit and explain what you mean by that question and what you're trying to get at, and how that is the big argument for protecting unborn life?
Absolutely. You know, it's human nature when you're in an argument with someone and you're losing to change the subject. I mean, I know none of us who have been married 30 years or more have ever done that with our spouses, but you know what I mean. It's human nature. Well, people love to talk about choice, privacy, trusting women, not forcing one's religion, not forcing one's morality. The government shouldn't be involved, and yada, yada, yada. Arguments they would never make if we were talking about killing toddlers. They only make those arguments about the unborn. And here's why, Todd. They are assuming the unborn are not human. They're not arguing for it. They're assuming it. It would be like me saying to you, when did you stop cheating on your taxes? And you say, well, I never cheated on my taxes. That's not what I asked you. When did you stop? Well, you would correctly say, excuse me, you're assuming the very thing you're trying to prove here with that question. In other words, you're begging the question, assuming what you're trying to prove. Well, that's what people do on abortion. They make arguments where it's simply assumed the unborn aren't human. For example, when the President of the United States says we should all celebrate abortion because abortion is good for, quote, everyone, unquote, Um, does everyone include the unborn, Mr. President? Notice he simply assumes the unborn are not human. Now, he didn't call it abortion, he called it reproductive freedom, by which he means abortion, of course. But notice in his statement, he assumes the unborn aren't human. He would never argue that way if we were talking about killing toddlers, never argue that way if we were talking about killing adults. In other words, he's assuming the unborn aren't human. And we have to force people to deal with that assumption. We're not going to let them get away with it. We're going to flush it out into the open and make the main thing the main thing. You got to answer the question, what is the unborn, before you can answer the question, can we kill the unborn? And it's that first question our culture wants to ignore.
So the book, The Case for Life, why did you write it, and what is the main point of that book? What will a reader take away?
The main thesis of the book is that the pro-life position can compete in the marketplace of ideas if Christians properly articulate it and properly understand it. I wrote the book for lay Christians, where I tried to take the smart academic arguments and make them understandable to people who maybe don't have a graduate degree, people who don't have time to do a deep dive into Peter Singer or Michael Tooley or someone who is an academic opponent of ours. I wrote it for the layperson to equip him or her to engage not only their fellow church members, but people in the marketplace, at work, at school, that they encounter, a neighbor over the backyard fence. How can you at least understand what the main issue is and maybe ask a good questions to help get them thinking?
Scott, in Kentucky in November this year, November the 8th, we have a constitutional amendment on the ballot that says to protect human life, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to secure or protect a right to abortion or require the funding of abortion. We're part of a campaign to vote yes on number 2. How would you encourage Kentucky voters to go and support this constitutional amendment?
Well, they need to support pro-life legislation, including your amendment, for this reason. If we don't, unborn children end up in the dumpster. We now have a chance to change the laws in this country in a way that we did not prior to the Dobbs decision. What the Dobbs decision did is get the federal government out of the abortion issue. What it did is say that one branch of the federal government, the Supreme Court, is no longer going to be the sole legal authority on this issue. Instead, the legislative and executive branches at both the federal and state level are going to set abortion policy. That means in our individual states, we have an opportunity to protect unborn humans, and we should do it. Now, I know there's some Christians who think that, well, getting involved politically, isn't that a distraction from what I should be as a Christian? No, our Christian worldview should apply to all areas. We should not bifurcate our Christian worldview and say, oh, it applies over here to the gospel, but not where I live in the real world. That is not a biblical worldview. And by the way, in Scripture, God holds sovereigns responsible for upholding justice for the poor, the weak, and those who are not protected. Who is the sovereign in a constitutional republic like ours? We are, the people. So that means we have a role to play. And we need to get involved, and we need to be willing to support pro-life legislation and amendments that will help protect children.
Scott, in just a few seconds, could you list one or two other resources along with your book, The Case for Christ, for those who want to try and understand the issues better?
Well, in addition to my book, The Case for Life, I would suggest that people consider going to Frank Turek's Cross-Examine page. I have a course there on the ethics of abortion that's going to start in January. Okay. And it's a certificate course. We're going to take a deep dive into the most deep arguments the other side makes. We're going to look at thinkers like Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Kate Greasley, and learn how to answer these critics of the pro-life view, plus learn to make our own case in a very persuasive way. It's 10 weeks. You will work very hard, but I promise you, you will come out of it having mastered the pro-life position and knowing how to defend it. And it's worth every penny you'll spend. You can go to Frank Turek's crossexamine.org site to register for that.
Oh, that's very good. I'd also encourage folks to, if you listen to podcasts, listen to Serial Killer, which tells the story of Herbert Gosnell, the abortion mill in Philadelphia. It's absolutely sickening to hear what went on there. State did not inspect that facility for, I think, 17 or 18 years, and the results are are clear. Last question. This is leadership lessons. So tell us about an experience, Scott, that shaped your approach to leadership or your understanding of what leadership is supposed to be.
Well, I had a college pastor when I was in my university years, Daniel Brown, and he had a way of approaching leadership that was not popular with a lot of the established leadership of churches. His view was get people in the game with all their imperfections, get them in the game before they've mastered things. Yes, they're going to make a ton of mistakes, but get them in the game. And that has caught on with me, and that's been a motto of mine. I try to get speakers in the game, I train them, and Daniel Brown never cared if you made a mistake. In fact, he used a fishing example. He said, listen, when you're out fishing and you get a snag, you might try for a couple of seconds to get it free, but then it's time to cut the line and focus on the future. Hook up a new rig. And he was constantly telling us, it's not the mistakes you make that are going to matter. Get up, focus on the next thing you can do, and go do it. And he really enforced that well. And I liked how he did it on the negative side too. He said, remember, your days are numbered. And on Judgment Day, you're not going to be asked how many snags you hit. You're going to be asked how many things did you drop in the water. Or as Wayne Gretzky famously said, you're going to miss 100% of the shots you never take. Oh, yeah. So I much prefer to get people in the game. I have brought up quite a few people under me who speak on pro-life apologetics, some of whom work for me. And of course, they spend their first 10 years making some mistakes, as did I, as I still do. And yet, it is very important to get people in the game and encourage them to go forward, even though they feel inadequate. We can fix the things they get wrong. We can't fix silence.
Outstanding. I'm glad that people like Daniel Brown got you in the game, and you're trying to pass it along and help others as well. Scott, thank you for your ministry, your faithfulness. You're going to actually be in Kentucky next week to speak at our Friend of Life celebration. We look forward to having you here and seeing you in person. But thank you for taking the time to join Leadership Lessons, and thank you for your work on protecting the unborn.
Thank you, Todd.